Another episode of Getting to Know Seahawks Twitter, and I am very pleased to be joined by the one and only Corbin Smith. Corbin Smith covers the Seattle Seahawks at Seahawk Maven, SportsIllustrated.com. He does a podcast, and he is a guy that I very much get along with when we actually are able to get out at practice. Corbin, what's going on, buddy?
Not much, Paul. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting about the madness that was early this week. We've only had a couple days of off-season talk, and I'm already ready for the next season to start.
I am too. Can we please fast forward ahead? My God, I was hoping we'd get a couple of days. For you, it's different too. For me, I just react to all of this. You've got to do write-ups on everything that Russell Wilson's saying. So let's just walk back through the weekend. On Sunday, Jason La Canfora comes out where Russell Wilson's camp is frustrated that Russ has been sacked almost 400 times. What was your first reaction to that?
So I actually tweeted about it because I had some people that read my stuff regularly, and they were just waiting like, where's your piece on this? And I said, I'm not writing anything on this because this has happened like 3 years in a row. Russell Wilson's cap hit is $39 million. I feel like Dr. Evil right now, $39 million. And I just don't envision any way that this is going to happen right now. So I'm like, I'm not going to write anything on this. And then, of course, we know what has happened in the last 24 hours. And so by that point, I felt compelled that, I at least need to entertain this. I still don't see any way Russell Wilson's getting traded before next season. The only guarantee is he's going to be under center in week 1 for the Seahawks. But now I'm kind of wondering a little bit about 2022.
Right. Things changed because then on the Dan Patrick show, we heard from Russ. And after Dan pushed him a little bit, he expanded on that frustration. Then there's a Zoom press conference, and it feels like after Greg Bell pushed him a little bit, he finally was straight with his answers. Because we know him. He dances around these answers probably better than he's able to dance around in the pocket of all these pass rushers. He does a really good job of that. I'm with you. My first reaction to seeing this from Jason La Canfora when I was covering the Texans in Houston, longtime beat reporter for the Houston Chronicle, John McClain, when he was on the air with us on Sports Radio 610, regularly called Jason La Canfora Jason No Confirma, which is a bad joke and cheesy, but I always was to myself thinking, all right, well, it's Jason La Canfora. How much stock do I put into this? But he did interview Russ last offseason, I think about Antonio Brown specifically, and Russ was like, yeah, I'd like to bring aboard Antonio Brown. And then you hear these things. Interesting that you bring up 2022. I think we could talk about the short term in a moment, but do you really see the Seahawks thinking to themselves, it's not worth the headache? Because even if Russ is addressing something that, let's be honest, he actually is right about. He is getting sacked too much. Partly that's on him. Partly that's on the scheme. Partly that's on the offensive line. I still don't care. At the end of the day, I still want to have one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL.
Yeah, I don't think the Seahawks are going to have any interest in moving him. I don't see the things that were said. Now, this was just my perspective being a former coach and being a former running back. I don't know how I would have felt if I was Dwayne Brown or one of those other guys hearing the comments that Russell Wilson made yesterday about the pass protection issues. And I guess this is the reason that I took those comments, and I was a little bit baffled by them. And I think the linemen probably are a little baffled by it because I watched every game on All 22 multiple times. That's something that I do every single week. And there were only a handful of games that I thought the offensive line did not pass protect well. Even the game against the Buffalo Bills where Wilson was getting hit all the time, some of it was just they got out-schemed. They were bringing extra blitzers, and the Seahawks, and when you have an extra guy coming, it's on the quarterback to be able to pick that up. And he was not doing a good job hitting his hot read. And then the New York Giants game is another one that comes to mind. There were so many plays. He had 3 seconds or more in the pocket, and there were receivers open. He wasn't getting rid of the football. And so, again, this is a multi-tiered issue. This is not all on the offensive line. They played horribly in the playoff game. You can't deny that. But I think that this group was much better this season than we've seen maybe since the Super Bowl year. When they won the Super Bowl, they haven't had an offensive line. Excuse me. They haven't had an offensive line that played as well as this group did this year.
Right.
And so I look at the injuries they had at the end of the season. Brandon Shell was not healthy. I really wish they would. I know he wanted to play against his old team, but I wish they would have just rested him instead of playing him against the Jets. Because I think if he's fully healthy in that playoff game, you have a much different result, at least with the pass protection. But there were a lot of other issues going on with this offense. And so they had to wipe the slate clean, and that's what they've done by bringing in a new offensive coordinator. I just, I look at 2022 again. I don't think the Seahawks are going to want to get rid of him, but if we do have a situation where the Seahawks drop back in the standings some, or somehow they miss the postseason and the offensive line is a big part of that problem, then I think you're going to see Russell Wilson. He's showing right now he will wield his power. He's figured out the power he has as a franchise quarterback. He will make another power play in 2022. And with only 2 years left in his contract, he's got a lot more leeway to be able to push his way out if he wants to.
It's really tricky to figure out what to do in that situation because Pete Carroll's been so valuable to this organization. But at the same time, you've got a quarterback. I think what you saw in New England when this relationship between Tom Brady and Bill Belichick ended is that Belichick said, all right, he's 43. I mean, I'm not betting on that for the future. And I wonder if the organization, the Seahawks, maybe look at the two. They look at Russell Wilson, they look at Pete Carroll, and they think to themselves, man, Pete's done a great job, but we got to find a way to make sure that Russ is here a little bit longer. Because, of course, Pete, he still wants to keep coaching. I don't think he's showing any signs of slowing down on that front. The bridge, there's got to be a way to bridge the gap between these two parties. I mean, Seahawks Twitter is divided in this way where it feels like if you are someone right now who is saying Russ holds the football too long, you're going to get attacked by those people that are super into supporting Russ. The same people who, if you were to say, well, look, I mean, Russell's contract does kind of make the Seahawks a little bit less able to go after an offensive lineman. They're going to be saying, oh, how dare you? But on the same front, I mean, Russ isn't wrong. That is true. Like they could be better at blocking for him, and he could be better, as you said, at getting rid of the football. Is there a way, much like Seahawks Twitter hopefully someday will be unified, that Russ, Pete, and John can get on the same page to the point where a couple months from now, we're looking back at this and saying, remember that fight we had? Classic us.
Get back to the Super Bowl. That's how you mend your bridges. And honestly, it comes down to the offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron. And I will say this, I have talked to a few sources that know a lot of information on that offensive coordinator hiring situation. And I've heard some somewhat different responses on how Wilson really responded to all this. A couple of the sources I've talked to said that he was kind of lukewarm on it and that Waldron was just the best candidate of the ones that were there. And then a couple of the sources I've talked to said he was really excited about the opportunity to work with him and the play action potential, running more under center to be able to do play action, implementing the run game to work off it. So you can take whatever it's worth there, but he's not going to come out publicly and say that he didn't like that hiring. But I do think that he made it clear he was not on board with Schottenheimer leaving. And so I do think that was a bigger factor maybe than he let on speaking with media members. I really think that this is me sticking in my personal opinion. Schotty was not perfect, but going back and looking at the film, I don't know how much of this you can pin on him in the second half. There were receivers open in a lot of those late season games, and Russ was just gun shy. And so that kind of links back to Pete Carroll. We got to be more conservative. You're turning the football over because of how a couple games went. There was just a lot of things, a lot of small things that build up over a couple week span. And once those dominoes fell, they just couldn't get things back together. And so that's when you end up making a move like parting ways with Brian Schottenheimer and bringing in a new coordinator. And so really Waldron holds the key. No pressure, buddy. He holds the key here to trying to bridge this and try to marry what Russell Wilson wants to do. He wants a more up-tempo attack. He still wants to throw the ball a lot. Pete Carroll wants to run the ball, which quite frankly, if they would have ran the ball more against the Rams in the playoff game, I think they probably advance in that game. And so your anti-run people aren't going to like that response. But if you were watching the game, the under center runs, they were having success. They just didn't stick with it. And so maybe that was the biggest beef that Carroll and Schottenheimer had. But again, Waldron, he is that middleman that now has a tremendous responsibility as a first-time play caller. You got to bridge Wilson and Carroll's desires into one. I think it's doable, but right now with what's going on, the things that have been said, again, good luck, buddy. This is going to be a tough first coordinator position to jump into.
100%. It's interesting you mentioned that about the anti-run people. I want the anti-run people to explain something to me. And I went back through the last 9 games of the regular season when I wrote, hey, look, it's time to move on from Brian Schottenheimer. they were throwing it, calling play calls that involved Russ either getting sacked or taking off on scrambles or just throwing a pass 41 times to 21 carries a game that were handed off to running backs. I mean, that's quite the split for those people who are like, oh, well, they got really conservative. The Brian Schottenheimer comments are interesting because it's definitely clear he had a close personal relationship of sorts. If maybe they were some football issues, I don't know, but it definitely seems like they liked each other. And then going back to what you had said a little bit earlier about the two groups that you talked to about Shane Waldron, I want to focus on the first group that you talked about, because the first group saying Russ was maybe lukewarm on it would be kind of consistent with his visit with Colin Cowherd, because that's the first thing where we heard from Russ this offseason. And I just wondered, okay, what was the point of that? You got a new offensive coordinator. Do you really need to linger on the struggles of the offense last year, it being passive when you've brought in somebody new?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I didn't listen to that entire interview. I have listened to the two from this week in entirety, but going off of what I was told, again, a couple of the sources that I spoke with that mentioned that, what I have been hearing through a lot of different vines is that he was not happy with a lot of the candidates that they were considering. And honestly, from my perspective, like when I heard Adam Gase's name come up, that was the first one I was like, ugh, Peyton Manning was the reason he's got a career. Mm-hmm. But there's a number of other guys that are on that list that either didn't have experience, or I was looking at what they've done as NFL coaches. I'm like, I don't know that that's the guy that's going to be able to bridge the gap between these two. And a lot of them were more oriented towards what Pete was wanting. And so I could understand why he was maybe not super excited about a lot of the guys that they were looking at that were being rumored as potential candidates. Waldron is the one guy, though, that I was looking at, and that one of the Packers assistants also was one that was on my radar, their quarterback coach, thinking that might be somebody that you can appease what Wilson wants to do, and you can still have a focus on the run game. And so from that standpoint, if he's able to implement that ground game that Pete Carroll wants, and they're still able to get a lot of play action in, and really this is the big key to me, can you create separation for your receivers with pre-snap motion? Because to me, that was the one area that Brian Schottenheimer really struggled all 3 years that he was here. Not that they didn't use pre-snap motion, but it seemed like at times they were just doing it to do it. There's got to be a purpose to that motion, which the Rams have been as good as any team in the NFL at doing. If Waldron has learned a thing or two from Sean McVay, that's one area I think can instantly help this football team pre-snap to get receivers open, more quick options for Russell Wilson. So I expect he's going to be fully on board with it once they get out onto the field, whenever that time comes. We don't know if there's going to be any offseason activities this year, but whenever they do get on the field, he's going to go all in. That's the way Russell Wilson's program. But I do think it is worthwhile to note that based on some of the sources I did talk to, he wasn't necessarily, there was not a candidate that he was just like, oh man, I really, really want this guy. And so that's something that's interesting to monitor. Again, looking beyond 2021, depending what happens this year.
100%. Yeah, a lot of pressure, as you said, on Shane Waldron. There were a couple of moments this season, too, where you had mentioned as you watched through the film where Russ is holding onto the ball, maybe a little bit gun shy. And that goes into the, hey, did Pete come in and talk about being conservative? Did he get in Russ's ear and say, you better not throw an interception? You better not throw an interception, or something like that, as if he was going to ground him or punish him or something like that. But you mentioned with this Brian Schottenheimer offense that there may have been actually alternative routes for Russ to go to instead of those guys that were deep down the field. Why is it that you think that Russ went, and this is how Michael Bumpus, former Coug, always a Coug, former Seahawk for a moment, described it, that Russ went from going low to high to low. Was that, do you think, and this is opinion, this is conjecture, because of something that the head coach might have told him, if it wasn't necessarily something that you saw on the field from the actual play calls themselves?
So I actually asked Russ about this during one of the press conferences. I actually think it was after the Giants game. I asked him if he thought maybe he had overcompensated a little bit after those couple games, interceptions. And of course, he responded by saying, I don't think I have any issues with being decisive, things like that. So he wasn't going to go down that road when I asked him that question. But I do think Pete Carroll, absolutely, he mentioned in a couple press conferences, he did mention to Russ that we need to protect the football, which is understandable. I do wonder, though, again, I've mentioned this a couple times already, that Was the wording of that, did it just really, was it something that Russell Wilson just took to heart too much? Because the game that jumped out to me, the 49ers game in week 17, I got a couple plays that I will probably remember for the next 15 years. I don't know why, but they just immediately jumped to my brain. But there was a play where Jacob Hollister came wide open on a crossing route. They were in the red zone, and Wilson was rolling out to his left. He looked like he was going to throw the football, and he pumped himself out. He didn't throw the ball. Jacob Hollister had an easy touchdown. And I'm just looking at that play, and I'm thinking, first 5 weeks of the season, Russell Wilson's throwing that football. There's no doubt in my mind. This was the most gunshot that I'd seen. And there were a few other plays in that game that DK Metcalf was wide open, and he just didn't pull the trigger. And so you just got to wonder, was it a confidence issue at that point? Or did it just all stem back to what Carroll had told him, protect the football, so he's not taking any chances, which, quite frankly, those were not chances. Those are easy completions for an NFL quarterback, especially if Russell Wilson's standards. And so that was the game that really hit me. It's like, yeah, there's a few plays here where maybe the pass protection wasn't perfect, but all the elite quarterbacks can handle that. They can handle situations where they've got pass rushers bearing down on, they can deliver the football, and he just wasn't doing it. And so to me, there were some accountability issues. Now, since the season ended, he has mentioned several times that he's got to play better, but at the end of the season, it didn't seem like he was really addressing that. And I do think that he holds a lot of responsibility for the struggles that they had those last 2 months.
The things that have rubbed me the wrong way coming out of Russ's mouth, and again, we touched on this before we started, there is an element of, well, Russ is finally speaking up. He's kind of being prodded into it, and there's some pushback to it. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that. I'll just say, whenever I hear him say legacy, I don't care, but I get it. Every quarterback cares about their legacy. So who am I to go down that road? And then the other thing is, when he was talking about some of the sacks that he's taken and extending plays, he said, like, look, I'm a part of it, but sometimes when I extend a play, I'm throwing touchdowns. I'm like, well, okay, that's not every single time, Russ. It's not every single time. That's some of the time. And that side of it is where, when I look at Russ and what he's saying, I'm like, okay, I don't need to hear this. Just spare me with that. But there are other things that he has said. I mean, I think it's fair to bring up the offensive line. I do. And I am very curious as to how they address it.
Yeah, I'm glad he brought that up, because it's something that I actually wrote an article on yesterday, because I think this is probably one of the things, when you look back at how John Schneider has operated throughout most of his time in Seattle, he's followed Ted Thompson's lead. And he has not been overly active going after big names in free agency. Really, the last time that they splurged in free agency on a big signing was when they signed Sidney Rice and Zach Miller back in 2011. Now, you had much different dynamics there. Russell Wilson was not on the roster yet. They didn't really have the franchise quarterback, and they were just trying to build something. That was early in Pete Carroll's time and John Schneider's time. So they were just trying to build a roster. But ever since that point, and obviously a lot of it's had to do with finances, they haven't had the money to go out and spend on guys. But I absolutely think John Schneider has got to, again, look at Ted Thompson's book, the end of his time in Green Bay, even when he was an advisor for the Packers the last few years. They have been much more aggressive going after game changers in free agency. Zadarius Smith, Preston Smith a couple years ago, give him a couple pass rushers, instantly improved that defense. I look at the free agent class this year, and you have to consider, yeah, the Seahawks only have like $4 million in cap space right now, but they can create cap instantly by converting base salary in Russell Wilson or Bobby Wagner or both into signing bonus. They can extend some players and open cap them up. They could have $30 million in cap space like that. And so why not go out and get somebody like Corey Linsley or Brandon Scherf? Go get yourself a true upgrade. You can appease Russell Wilson, and you can then go out and get – this is the other guy I think they should go after, T.Y. Hilton. I don't think the Indianapolis Colts are going to be throwing huge bucks at him. And I think when you look at the other free agents in the market, other teams are hurting financially. If you could get T.Y. Hilton for like $7 or $8 million a year, which I think is potentially feasible, if he hits the market, Colts don't re-sign him, you put him – I've always wanted to see him with the best quarterback from the 2012 draft class. We got to see him with Andrew Luck, but I'd love to see him with Russell Wilson. He is the third receiver. You upgrade his receiver room. You upgrade the offensive line in front of him, and you extend some other players on defense, and you've got cap structure. You can still go out and add a couple of other lower-level free agents, but don't go spend $8 million on Luke Jokel this year. Don't go spend $7 million on Greg Olsen I mean, it just seems like John Schneider has burned money when he's tried to do this mid-level approach a lot of the time. I'd like to see him go out and be like, you know what? I'm going to go get me a proven player that's not over the hill or is not a former first-round bust. I'm going to go get a proven guy that I know is an all-pro caliber player. I've got the money. I'm going to go use it constructively on a player like I said, Lindsley to me is the one that makes the most sense. Instantly upgrade the center position. Now, Russell Wilson's got a better offensive line in front of him by default with that addition, and I still think they could find ways to open up a little more cash to add a few more pieces around him.
Let's come back to T.Y. Hilton because I actually wrote that in my show notes, and because there's been so much Russell Wilson stuff going on the last couple of days, I'm really excited that someone else is on the same wavelength as me. I watched that guy in Houston just murder the Texans over and over and over again.
He's a fantastic football player.
I am obsessed with T.Y. Hilton. He's so fast. He's got that straight line speed. He's confident. We'll get back to T.Y. Hilton in a moment. When you talk about the offensive lineman, I think Russ wants the Seahawks to sign a big ticket offensive lineman, but
absolutely.
The question is, how do you make sure that you're not signing Andrew Norwell, you're not signing Nate Solder, I guess to a lesser extent Trent Brown. Trent Brown was good his first year. Last year, this past season's a weird one with COVID and injuries and all of that. That's where I understand maybe why John Schneider has approached things the way that he has in free agency with offensive linemen, because I do think it is a bit of a crapshoot. You do have to make that. You have to see if that guy does fit in your scheme, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. Do you have concern over that, where you're changing your stripes all of a sudden, and if you do end up with one of these bad offensive lineman contracts, you might be hurting yourself going forward?
So I understand what you're saying, and with a player, I'll use Norwood for example. Andrew Norwood had one really good season. Those are the guys that always scare me in free agency. Oh, you were an all-pro last year. You made your first Pro Bowl. That's why if I'm another team looking at Shaquille Griffin, I'm like, I don't know. He's had one really good season, and the other three were up and down. And so I'd be concerned about throwing a lot of money at him. But when you look at Corey Lindsley, Lindsley's been a really good player for a long time for the Packers. He's had a couple of seasons. He missed a few games with injury, but for the most part, been durable, and he's been consistent. He can run block. He's a very good pass protector. I would be confident he's going to be 30 years old. He's not an old man. I mean, we're seeing offensive linemen play well into their 30s at a high level. So I would be confident going after him. And you look at Brandon Scherf, he has been a beacon of consistency on some really bad football teams. You bring him into Seattle, I think they'd move Damian Lewis to center if they did that. But you have Brandon Scherf at your right guard spot, a guy that's been a perennial all-pro, a Pro Bowl caliber player, and he's only 29. He's right in the midst of his career. And Joe Thuney from the New England Patriots is another one that you look at his consistency across the board. He has gotten better as a run blocker, but that's not his biggest strength. He has been an elite pass protector now for the last 4 years. So he's also a younger player than the other two I mentioned. So those guys have more than 1 year of a body of work. They have consistently been among the best at their position. Those are the guys that you throw money at. There's always risk in free agency because the guy could get hurt, but those three players, any one of those three, instantly upgrades your offensive line, not just for now, but the next several seasons. And like I said, I would just shift my offseason approach free agency-wise because they have been trying to find a long-term answer at center. I don't think Ethan Posick is that guy. I think you could sign him another one-year deal and maybe get by, but I don't see him as a long-term solution. A player like Lindsley could be your starter there the next 4 or 5 plus seasons. I think you have to go out and make a bold move. It would get your quarterback back on your side. It shows you're doing what he wants. And it improves your Super Bowl chances. There's no question about that.
And if you want to shut Russell Wilson up, if you sign T.Y. Hilton, I think he's going to shut up, right?
Yeah.
Let's go in detail about T.Y. Hilton. So I remember some of the first games that I saw him against the Houston Texans, and I was just like, wow, this guy's incredible. You know, I gave Ryan Grigson a lot of crap for the job he did in Indianapolis. He gets GM of the year after his first draft, mainly because of Andrew Luck. But he did get T.Y. Hilton, who I think has just been one of the scariest deep threat wide receivers in the NFL. He plays in the AFC South, so he's kind of forgotten. What have you made of him over the last couple of years based off of what you've seen? I'm now all of a sudden a little removed from the AFC South, so I'm not quite seeing him as closely. And I do know that there have been some injury concerns, I would say specifically this past season. But I do know that this guy is just a heck of a talent. And I'm curious as to how you'd see him fit because, look, you got DK Metcalf, you got Tyler Lockett already. That might be a difficult squeeze to get in another guy who has been a number one wide receiver into the mix, because you got to give all these guys their touches.
So this is what I'm most intrigued by with Hilton. I think he is now at that stage of his career. He's 31 years old. He can still move. You watch the film, he can still fly. Maybe not as fast as he did when he came in the league, but he is still a guy that can burn you downfield. And what really intrigues me most about him, though, he's been good at this his entire career. The underneath passes and being able to create yards after the catch. The Seahawks have been atrocious at that the last several years, even going back into the Bevel era. They just struggled to create yards after the catch. And Hilton can run routes out of the slot from the outside. He had almost 800 receiving yards last year. He's a few years removed from his last 1,000-yard season, but I wouldn't let that worry you. You don't need him to be a 1,000-yard receiver because of the other guys that you've got. But I think is the third receiver that you can interchange between slot and outside, and the fact that he never had a DK Metcalf next to him in Indianapolis. He didn't have a Tyler Lockett next to him. He's got both of them next to him now. Opposing defenses now suddenly are going to have a much harder time doing two deep safety coverages for the biggest reason that you're like, they've got T.Y. Hilton now in the intermediate game. He catches the football and he can turn upfield and pick up yardage. It really compromises things for the secondary and for the play call on the other side. So I just think they need to upgrade that third receiver spot. They need to get somebody else that's a real game changer. And I'm really intrigued by Hilton. I could see Josh Reynolds being another guy because Waldron has coached him. I could see him being another one that maybe fits. But Hilton, if I'm the GM, if I'm John Schneider, that's the guy I'm calling like, hey, I know you like Indianapolis, but I've got Russell Wilson. And I've got two other star receivers around you. And then if Russell Wilson wants to throw the football a bunch, we can do that. Again, I upgrade the offensive line with Corey Linsley. Maybe I can protect him a little bit better too. So that would be my blueprint. That's the way I would approach this offseason. Instead of signing a bunch of mid-level guys for bargain contracts, I'm spending my money on a couple real difference makers that I think can get me to the Super Bowl.
It's funny you mentioned the offense, and we've talked a lot about the offense because obviously Russell Wilson's spoken a lot. We haven't talked about the defense at all. So point-blank question, Corbin, is the Seahawks defense good enough to win them a championship right now?
I think so. I think that what we saw the last 2 months of the season, here's the difference between the defense and the offense. You've got your question marks. There's some players that you have to make some really tough decisions on, but they have pieces in place. I still think Bobby Wagner's got a lot of really good football left in him. I've seen some people say they should try to move him right now. I can entertain those discussions a little bit, but then I look at his film and he's still such a good player, and his value off the field is off the charts. And so you've got Bobby Wagner in the middle. Jordan Brooks, I think, is going to be an absolute stud. The last 4 or 5 games, he was a wrecking ball. He's getting better in coverage. KJ Wright might not be back for that reason because Jordan Brooks is ready to have the keys handed to him. He's your full-time weak side linebacker now. And they've got some guys up front they really like. Alton Robinson's got a chance to be a really good player. I think LJ Collier had a very underrated season in 2020. He might be a guy that busts out with 5, 6, 7 sacks next year because he had a lot of quarterback pressures this year. And this was really his first full season as a starter for this team. And he can play 3-tech. He can reduce him inside. And the secondary finally came together. Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams should be cornerstones of your defense for the next 3 or 4 years minimum. And so I've seen some people saying trade Jamal Adams. That's blasphemy. Why would you do that after what you gave up for
best playmaker
his
on
defense was so different when he was on the field.
Yeah.
And I've heard some people say, well, he's just a pass rushing safety. He was playing with like half of a hand because broken fingers, had a couple dropped interceptions. I don't think he drops if his fingers aren't broken. He couldn't get his hand up to deflect passes in the playoffs because he had a labrum tear. He's going to be healthy. You're going to have him back healthy. I expect he's going to be much better in coverage just for the fact he's healthy, and they know how to deploy him better. They now have had a full year with him. And so he's 25 years old. He's a perennial all-pro. He has got to be on your team for the next several years. If it's going to cost a bunch of money, which it's going to, invest the money in him. That's not a guy you're going to draft where you draft at. You're not going to get a player like that. You got to lock him up. So they've got the pieces in place. I think the 2 tough decisions they got to make, what are we going to do with Shaquille Griffin? And what are we going to do with Jaron Reed? That to me is the big. I just don't see how you can get rid of Carlos Dunlap after what he did for this football team. And I know he's older than Jaron Reed, and I know he was battling a foot injury at the end of the season, but he was a game changer. There was a domino effect on all the pass rushers, including Jarran Reed. Jarran Reed was much better when Carlos Dunlap was there. And I think Cedric Lattimore is a player to watch at that 3-tech position as well. And from what I've been told, the organization is very high on him. So you saw how he played in the playoff game. He had 6 tackles on like 26 snaps. So they like him a lot. I could see Jarran Reed being that piece on defense that they don't want to get rid of, but they have to trade. And ultimately, I expect he and Dunlap are not both going to be on this team next year. So you got to make a choice with their cap hits, which one you want to extend. I think Reed, when you consider that they've already got Poona Ford, who's going to be up for a contract here soon. You've got Brian Monet. You have Lattimore. There's some good defensive linemen in this draft class that could be available when they pick too. And they've proven they can take late round undrafted guys and turn them into solid NFL players. I think Jarran Reed might be that one domino to fall. And as for Griffin, it depends what other teams think of him. If the price point falls below 11, 10 million per year, the Seahawks then might be willing to do it. But I'm not throwing 14, 15 million at him a year. He hasn't earned that money.
Yeah.
He's been very inconsistent his first 4 years. You got 1 Pro Bowl out of him, and it was a good but not great season in my opinion. So I like DJ Reed. I like the idea of bringing Quinton Dunbar back on a very cheap 1-year deal, because if it doesn't go well, then okay, cool. We didn't spend much money. If it goes well, he can be a Pro Bowl caliber player and hopefully no offseason issues this year so he can come in with a fresh start. But I just don't know that they're going to be throwing that money at Griffin. I think they have other position groups that they're going to want to address with the limited money that they have. So those are the 2 question marks I have, but I really like this defense. I think they got a lot of building blocks here, and Ken Norton Jr. really figured out how to use those pieces in the second half last season.
Yeah, he did a good job at the end of the season. He got a lot of criticism. I got to give him credit. The second half of the year, they did get a lot better. I do have some questions, though. Now, man, I liked what I saw from Dunbar early on in the year, and he was never the same after his awesome game against New England. I thought he played fantastic in that game where he broke on a couple of routes by Cam Newton. He intercepted the second one. Also, defensively, so after Quinton Dunbar, okay, that's one corner spot. You mentioned Bobby Wagner a little bit earlier. So my big issue with Bobby Wagner, the cap hits a lot. I don't see the same aggression that I'd like to see out of him. When I see KJ Wright, I see a guy who flies through blockers to the football. When I see Jordan Brooks, I see a guy who looks like he's going to be really capable of that, just given his size. Bobby Wagner definitely makes plays. I don't think they have him going forward enough, if that makes sense. I feel like when they use him as a blitzer, if you saw that first game against the 49ers, he just killed everybody.
He's a nightmare.
Right. I'd love to see him used more in that way. Instead, there are moments, and they're sporadic, but I can't stop thinking about one play against the Rams where he's got a guy lined up, and I think it was Akers, and Akers just bounces out to the right, and Wagner's just frozen foot there. Again, you can't put it all on him. I mean, they're the defensive line in the way. They have to do something about it, but there's a part of me that wonders if you're really getting that first-team All-Pro out of Bobby Wagner. You're definitely getting a good linebacker, and as you mentioned, you're getting a great locker room presence. And it's going to sound like I'm just dumping all over the guy. I just feel like he is not quite the aggressive linebacker that he maybe used to be.
And that might be a decent argument. I will say this, though. I don't know what that defense does in that game without Bobby Wagner, though. I know the play you're talking about. That was an embarrassing whiff that I'm sure that going back watching the film, he watched a couple times, said never again.
And it happens. But I mean, right? You can't judge one player, a player off of one play.
Yeah, but think about it. I think he had 16 tackles.
He did have a lot.
Game, and he was playing the whole second half with a knee injury. I didn't think he was going to play in the rest of the game when he had to check out, and then he returned to the game, just showing his toughness and stuff. So I don't know. I just felt like I thought he had a better year than he did the year before. His coverage numbers were much better. He looked more comfortable out there. I still thought he played at an all-pro level. I don't know first team if that necessarily was the case, but the big issue here is just, if you can trade him now, you can get reasonable value. If you wait too long, you can't. Right. I understand that argument, but I still think he's just too important of a player to this defense. And up front, again, I like Jarran Reed. I thought Jarran Reed had a great second half. The Seahawks have just shown, in my estimation, that they can develop players there. And a nearly $14 million cap hit, you can't hold that for him and Carlos Dunlap.
Right.
You just can't. You could extend both of them, but now you have all those cap issues to worry about next year, whereas it wouldn't be as bad if you only did that with one player. So that's why I'm paid to talk about it, and John Schneider's paid to actually make these moves. But
the other name you mentioned, KJ Wright. Do you think there's any chance KJ Wright's back? And this year, I think, is going to be a different offseason for KJ Wright. You've got Gus Bradley as a defensive coordinator. You've got Dan Quinn also as a defensive coordinator. So I feel like those two might be looking at KJ and saying, all right, come with us. We'll pay you what you played like. Because there were times last year where I thought he was the Seahawks' best linebacker. And credit to him, because there were some questions, I think, about him. Even though he finished last season, the 2019 season, really strong, I thought he played out of his mind. But I do wonder if he's going to be back here next year. What do you think?
Yeah, I have the same reservations, and it pains me because KJ Wright is one of my favorite players to talk to on the Seahawks beat. He always gives incredible answers. He is an extremely sincere person. He's selfless on the field. He showed that by, even though he didn't want to do it, moving to Sam linebacker. And honestly, he was phenomenal at that position. And I think he could play another 3 or 4 years playing the Sam linebacker role the way Seattle does it, where he's up on the line of scrimmage a lot and he gets to set the edge and he's blitzing the quarterback more often. It disguises some of the athletic limitations that he is now dealing with. Whereas if he's playing that weak side off ball position, he can get exposed easily in coverage because he doesn't move overly well, but he's quick and his instincts compensate as well. We saw that when he made that play in Kyler Murray on that read option in week 11. Yeah. I'm like, KJ Wright made that play. So I would love to see him back. I think the Seahawks would love to see him back. The problem is going to be Jordan Brooks is ready to play. Jordan Brooks is ready for a full-time in nickel packages as well, playing weak side linebacker. He is your every down weak side linebacker. You can't justify paying KJ Wright what he deserves to play 40, 50% of the snaps as a strong side linebacker. And so if I had to make a prediction right now, I think there will be other teams. It's going to be different than a couple years ago coming off injury. There are going to be other teams that want him and are willing to pay for his services. I just don't think the Seahawks financially, I don't think it'd be a wise move given what they have on the roster and the investment they made in Jordan Brooks. If he's willing to come back at a lower price, which I just don't know that he's going to be willing to do that, and I don't blame him after how he played last year, I think the Seahawks are going to be forced to move on. Financially, they can't absorb him and do all the other things they need to do to try to upgrade this roster.
Corbin, I've really enjoyed your work since you've started coming to town. The Cedric Lattimore piece is fantastic. I encourage if people want to make a long read, that's a very good one. The feature story about a guy that maybe you don't know too much about. I'm curious as to how you got down this path where all of a sudden you're covering the Seahawks for Sports Illustrated, because I know we've talked, and I know you've been a teacher before, a history teacher, right?
I taught economics and history.
Okay.
Yeah. I've had a really long road to this, actually. I was a stand-up comedian for a while. I then was doing teaching mixed with comedy. I was coaching. I coached for 5 years at the high school level varsity football, coaching running backs, did some offensive line coaching too. So I was at Mount Si High School, which is in Snoqualmie, just outside of Seattle, and I loved it there. I was there for 1 year, and then they were overstaffed, and I was the last history teacher that was hired. So they said, we're going to have to move forward without you next year. And they were offering substitute teaching position stuff. I was like, you know what? I've been writing for fun for years. I'm not married. I don't have any kids. I'm going to try this out and just see what happens. And it's been a crazy journey to this point. I went from, all the writing for free to being in a position where now I get to cover the team, and I get to move out here, and it's been a lot of fun. And, the last couple of days have been interesting. I was kind of hoping for a break, but I think a lot of us probably were. But I've taken a long winding road, done a lot of stuff for just being 32 years old. Yeah.
And listen, I really enjoy your work. How would you describe Seahawks Twitter in one word? Everyone that's come on here has had to do this. So you could take your time. I'll allow you to filibuster by just blabbing a little bit. One word.
I'm going to use the word sporadic, because you don't know what you're going to get one day in, one day out, going to the next. You just don't know what you're going to get. Yesterday was a prime example of this because actually the last 3 days after the Super Bowl got over, it might be the tweet I've gotten the most retweets on in my entire life. I was tweeting about, man, this really puts in perspective how much people should appreciate Russell Wilson's career because of the lines he's played behind. And I was watching Patrick Mahomes get battered.
I think Russ was too.
Buccaneers the other night. And so a ton of people apparently agreed with that. But then yesterday, when I'm talking about the offensive line in 2020, I thought was much better than what these comments illustrate. Of course, you have people coming, he's never had good lines behind in front of him, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, hold your horses. Those two things don't have to be exclusive. He has had some really bad offensive lines, but last year they were pretty darn good for most of the year. And the film says that, the stats say it. So that's Seahawks Twitter in a nutshell, though. The mood can change in an instant. And I see it with the run game stuff too. There will be days where it's like, you know what, running the ball really does matter. And you'll see some people come out of the woodwork, and me being a running back guy, I get excited. I'm like, there may be hope. And then the next day it's like, we should throw 95% of the time. Okay. All right. So it's sporadic and it's extreme. I enjoy it, but I'm glad I already had lost my hair. Let's just put it that way.
I think we are two of the louder running back truthers that are on Seahawks Twitter. What do you think is going to happen with Chris Carson?
So if I had to make a prediction, I really like Chris Carson. I think the Seahawks are going to do whatever they can to try to bring him back because I think Pete Carroll really loves his running style. And I just don't know that you're going to be able to find a guy in this draft class that runs with the same aggressiveness and power that Chris Carson brings to the table. There's some intriguing backs in this class. The problem is going to come down to how much are other teams willing to pay. And that to me is the big unknown here because teams don't have money to spend. Running back is a position that's devalued. But at the same time, all it takes is one team being like, you know what? You were a 1,000-yard rusher 2 straight seasons. You were productive last year when given opportunities.
Like you said with Andrew Norwell.
As much, you might be the missing piece for our offense. Here's $10 million a year for 2 years. I don't know the Seahawks would even consider doing that. I think if they could get him back on a $7-8 million per year contract for a year or two, I think that John Schneider would jump through a hoop to do that because I think they really love the player. I don't know if it's going to happen. If I had to make a prediction right now, it's changed over the last couple of weeks. When the season ended, I thought they probably are going to lean that way. But now, knowing what I know about the direction they're probably going to be going with some of their other moves, I'm gonna say that he ends up with another team. If he's not swept up within a couple of days in free agency, the interest isn't there, then the Seahawks could absolutely bring him back. Right now, if I had to make a prediction, I'm just going to lean towards he's probably playing somewhere else.
Okay. Corbin, you're one of my favorites, man. I could talk football with you all day, I feel like. This has been a lot of fun. We definitely have to do this again. And thank you so much for joining me on Getting to Know Seahawks Twitter.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It was a blast. We'll have to do it again.
Definitely.